The Kamiti Maximum Prison
on trial for robbery with violence and murder and was condemned to death.
Tunaweza sema generous kwa marafiki zake, kupata pesa anagawa. So Shimoli aliweza kuwa na information mingi sana.
On the afternoon of July 17th, 6 armed men walked into the Bank of Baroda on Kenyatta Avenue in Nairobi. Some of them carried AK-47 rifles, while others carried 9mm pistols. But the robbery had actually begun several minutes earlier when 2 women entered the bank dressed as ordinary customers. They moved calmly through the banking hall, observing the security guards, studying the layout, and making sure nobody suspected what was about to happen. Moments later, armed men stormed in, took control of the bank within minutes, and escaped with 5 million shillings. Police immediately broadcasted an emergency alert across Nairobi about the robbery. Roadblocks were thrown up, and flying squad officers rushed to the city's major exit routes. They wanted to find the robbers before they disappear, but there was a problem. Every time detectives closed in, the gang seemed to already know, so when officers set up roadblocks, the suspects changed direction, and when they prepared raids, the hideouts were suddenly empty. The gang leader had obtained a stolen police walkie-talkie and was listening to officers as they planned the manhunt. His name was Edward Maina Shimoli, and this was only the beginning. Shimoli would go on to become one of the most feared armed robbers in Kenya, earning the nickname the Jackal for how sophisticated his operations were. He was eventually linked to 14 murders, numerous violent attacks, and some of the country's most daring bank robberies. But the robbery that day revealed something far more dangerous than his willingness to use violence. He built one of the country's most feared robbery gangs by using women to scout targets, move weapons without attracting suspicion, and carry out heists. Perhaps even more remarkably, Shimoli escaped from Kamiti Maximum Security Prison 3 times, repeatedly humiliating the very officers hunting him. Yet after his final arrest and eventual release years later, he made an unexpected request to remain in prison. Instead, he was forced to leave and wind up dead days later. So who exactly was Edward Shimoli? How did one man become one of the most feared criminals in Kenyan history? And why did he believe prison was safer than freedom? Welcome. This is Dark Hour Docs. Edward Shimoli grew up in Butere, Mumias, in western Kenya, before his family later relocated to Nairobi's Eastlands. There, he attended Ofafa Jericho Primary School and later Ofafa Jericho Secondary School. In his younger years, he was known as a jovial and easygoing with a passion for art, athletics, and sports. But as fate would have it, Shimoli entered the world of crime at the age of 20. Armed with a 9mm Taurus pistol, the weapon that would later become his trademark, he steadily built a reputation in Nairobi's underworld over the next decade. Police would eventually link him to violent robberies, murder, rape, drug trafficking, and a string of high-profile bank heists, making him one of the most feared criminals of his generation. Unlike most gangs at the time, however, Shimoli built his gang around women. This strategy always caught both security guards and police officers completely off guard. His most famous heist was the July 17, 1996 robbery at the Bank of Baroda, where they got away with 5 million shillings. The robbery had been carefully timed to coincide with Nairobi's busy midday traffic, allowing the gang to escape in stolen getaway vehicles before police could effectively seal off the city. But despite disappearing from the CBD with millions of shillings, their escape was something else. Shimoli already knew exactly where the police were waiting and avoided using those routes. On discovery, detectives were forced to abandon many of their normal tactics and rely on secure landlines and face-to-face meetings. Unable to find Shimoli directly, investigators turned their attention to the stolen money by raiding known money launderers, rogue car dealers, and black market currency traders. They believed that a gang carrying 5 million shillings would eventually need help moving the cash. Their pressure paid off, as one informant finally broke, providing investigators with a description of the getaway vehicle Shimoli was using. Armed with that information, undercover flying squad officers quietly positioned themselves along Nairobi's major exit routes. And after several days of surveillance, they finally spotted the vehicle traveling along Thika Road. Rather than rushing in immediately, detectives followed from a distance, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. And near the Safari Park Hotel along Thika Road, flying squad vehicles suddenly accelerated, boxed in Shimoli's car, and ordered the gang to surrender. But, trapped on the highway, Shimoli and his crew chose to fight their way out instead. They opened fire with automatic weapons, triggering a fierce gun battle in the middle of the road. During the exchange, police managed to shoot and kill one of Shimoli's key accomplices, with the ferocity of the gang's counterattack creating enough confusion for Shimoli to dive out of the vehicle and disappear into the nearby thickets. By the time the shooting ended, detectives had recovered the getaway vehicle and brought down one member of the gang. However, their main target had succeeded to escape. And over the next couple of months, police repeatedly laid traps hoping to capture him, but every operation somehow failed. Unknown to investigators, Shimoli was always aware of the planned raids, always one step ahead of the police. And as the robberies and murders continued to rise, the hunt intensified. A few months after the Bank of Baroda heist, Shimoli went into hiding on the outskirts of Nairobi. He was keeping a low profile while trying to launder his share of the 5 million shillings. But detectives were closing in. An underworld informant had provided information about his whereabouts, and investigators soon discovered that Shimoli was no longer using his real name. He had been moving under the identities Philip Opio Oma and Osman Arap Songak, but the aliases could not protect him forever. Acting on the intelligence, specialized police units surrounded his hideout and waited for the right moment. When officers finally moved in, Shimoli and his remaining loyalists refused to surrender. Gunfire erupted. In the middle of the chaos, one officer managed to outflank Shimoli, wrestle him to the ground, disarm him, and place him in handcuffs. For the first time, the Jackal was behind bars. Shortly afterward, Shimoli was brought before the High Court of Kenya in Nairobi under heavy security. Prosecutors presented evidence linking him to multiple capital offenses, and the court found him guilty of murder and armed robbery. He was sentenced to death by hanging and then transferred to the condemned cells of Kamiti Maximum Security Prison, where he awaited his execution. But Shimoli wasn't preparing to die and was busy studying. Inside Kamiti, Shimoli carefully observed the routines of prison officers, memorized guard movements, and identified weaknesses in the prison's security. Outside the walls, members of his gang were also putting money to work. Cash that had been hidden from his criminal operations was used to bribe prison wardens as he awaited the best opportunity to elope. And just one day before his scheduled execution, Shimoli disappeared. At dawn, compromised wardens deliberately left several internal security doors unlocked, creating a path out of the condemned cells. But as Shimoli crossed the prison compound, an officer who had not been bribed confronted him. The two men fought, and Shimoli fractured his leg before scaling the towering perimeter wall and disappearing into the morning fog. Kenya's most wanted prisoner was free again, but his freedom would not last. Because on February 18, 1997, 6 heavily armed robbers walked into the Standard Chartered Bank on Moi Avenue in Nairobi. At the time, Shimoli was still on the run following his escape from Kamiti. The gang carried out the robbery with remarkable precision by first overpowering bank employees, bypassed the security systems, emptied the strong room, and escaped to a getaway car waiting on Tamboya Street. The entire operation took roughly 5 minutes, and the robbers got away with an astonishing 96 million shillings. The robbery sent shockwaves through the city, with the stolen millions creating a new opportunity. Shimoli used his share of the money to expand his network of safe houses and finance the bribery of people who could help keep him hidden. And for months, this worked. But the size of the Standard Chartered robbery also triggered an unprecedented crackdown. The flying squad began targeting the criminal network surrounding the stolen money, putting increasing pressure on fences and informants across Nairobi. By mid-1997, one heavily pressured informant finally broke and gave detectives the location of the hideout where Shimoli was staying. This time, police wanted to avoid another shootout by launching a late-night operation. They quietly surrounded the house before forcing their way inside, where they caught Shimoli completely off guard. Detectives pinned him down before he could reach his weapons, and the Jackal was back in custody. But the police had not yet learned the lesson that Shimoli's money could be just as dangerous as his guns. While awaiting trial, he used his fortune from the Standard Chartered robbery to arrange another network of bribes. Money was funneled to poorly paid prison and police escort wardens, with one objective of creating a moment when no one was watching. That opportunity came in late 1997, when Shimoli was being transported under armed guard to the Nairobi law courts on City Hall Way for a routine mention. He had deliberately chosen the perfect environment and midday time for an escape, when the streets and court corridors were packed with people. The guards escorting him had already been compromised, as his handcuffs had been left loose. And as the officers moved him through the crowded corridor, Shimoli suddenly ripped his hands free, swung the heavy cuffs into the face of one of the guards, and ran. He burst through the courtroom doors and disappeared into the crowded streets of Nairobi, even before the shocked and injured officers could react. The Jackal had escaped again, and the humiliation was enormous.
Shimoli alikuwa mtu hatari ndani ya polisi, kwa sababu mara mingi Shimoli angeweza kutoweka na ama Shimoli anaweza kwa area fulani na mfahamu kwamba amesikika ako area fulani, lakini kidogo watu wakienda pale unakuta Shimoli tayari ametoweka.
The flying squad launched another city-wide manhunt, while the repeated failures triggered disciplinary action against several investigators. Some officers were immediately suspended, others interrogated for complicity, and some were dismissed from the force. During the crackdown, police killed 2 of Shimoli's close associates, both notorious violent criminals. Their deaths made Shimoli even more cautious and began operating mainly at night, moving between his multiple false identities. Eventually, police arrested him again and took him to the Kibera law courts under extremely tight security. This time, prosecutors came armed with a staggering list of accusations, which included 88 counts of assault, 14 murders, bank robberies, and attacking police officers. However, while being held inside the court cells, he disappeared once again. No one could explain how one of Kenya's most wanted criminals had walked out of one of the country's busiest courts, and no bullet was fired. His disappearance brought further emergency orders to recall both on-duty and off-duty officers, as Nairobi became the center of another massive manhunt. However, Weeks later, elite police officers would spot Shimoli traveling through the city in a stolen Mercedes-Benz and did not try to arrest him quietly this time around. So they opened fire, and a fierce gun battle erupted on the streets. Shimoli was shot several times and critically wounded before officers finally captured him alive. Because of the severity of his injuries, he was taken to Kenyatta National Hospital, but the police weren't taking any chances. Here, Shimoli was chained to a hospital bed and placed under permanent 24-hour armed guard. By now, his repeated escapes had become so extraordinary that some officers began comparing him to Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, the Venezuelan-born international terrorist better known as Carlos the Jackal. But even while lying wounded in a hospital bed, Shimoli was thinking about escape. He secretly managed to send a message to members of his inner circle who learned that he was about to be transferred back to Kamiti Prison. This time, though, the police were ready as they reinforced the convoy with more than 20 officers. But as the convoy approached Uhuru Park, Shimoli's gang struck, and without warning, armed men ambushed the police convoy. Bullets tore through the streets as officers returned fire, and when the shooting finally stopped, Shimoli and his attackers were gone. His gang had rescued their wounded leader and taken him to a secret hideout where hired doctors treated him until he recovered. The brazen operation against the police convoy in broad daylight shocked the country, and for the moment, the Jackal was free once again. After recovering from the hospital ambush, Shimoli was more determined than ever to strike back. He had vowed revenge against the officers who had repeatedly hunted him down. But while he was planning his next move, Nairobi's violence continued. Bodies were being discovered in forests, and detectives knew that as long as Shimoli remained free, the killings were unlikely to stop. By now, the SCPU had joined forces with the flying squad, and they decided to change their strategy once again. Instead of chasing Shimoli from one hideout to another, they would target the people around him, including low-level criminals, and pressured to cooperate. Slowly, investigators began penetrating the network that had protected Shimoli for years, with a lead coming sooner. And this would work by mid-August 1999, as detectives received intelligence pointing to one of Shimoli's hideouts in Kino, Kiambu, and a heavily armed team moved in. But when they reached the property, Shimoli was already gone, escaping only moments earlier. Yet, this time, detectives discovered the stolen police walkie-talkie he had been using to listen his officers coordinated the raid in real time. They also recovered an AK-47 rifle, 2 pistols, unused ammunition, a stolen car, and fake number plates that he used to carry out robberies. But the hurried escape and leaving the radio behind provided detectives with a chance of a lifetime. Because days later, on the afternoon of August 19, 1999, the cops quietly surrounded another property linked to Shimoli, avoiding a dramatic gun battle yet again. The officers maintained complete radio silence and deliberately launched the operation during the day, believing Shimoli would be less suspicious at that hour. They knocked on the front door, and assuming it was an ordinary daytime visitor, Shimoli opened it. He had left his weapons behind, and soon as he opened the door, detectives moved instantly, overpowering him before he could react. For the first time in years, the Jackal had nowhere to run and was taken into custody in a Kiambu police cell. Days later, he was charged yet again and returned to Kamiti Maximum Security Prison. And after years of humiliating the police, investigators believed the hunt for the Jackal had finally come to an end. Despite confessing to a horrifying trail of 14 murders, 18 rapes, and multiple bank robberies, Edward Maina Shimoli would spend only 8 years behind bars. By any measure, the accusations against him were enough to keep him in prison for the rest of his life, or even send him to the gallows. Yet, on March 15, 2007, Shimoli was scheduled for release, which shocked many people. Years of investigations had gradually fallen apart as evidence disappeared and witnesses either vanished or became too afraid to testify. Cases that had once seemed strong were no longer enough to keep him behind bars. But when the day finally came, Shimoli refused to leave, telling authorities that his life was in danger and asked to remain inside Kamiti Prison. To him, the prison he had escaped from 3 times now seemed safer than the streets outside, but the authorities had no legal grounds to keep him there. So they forced him to leave. Shortly afterward, Shimoli gave a rare television interview just outside the prison, claiming to have explosive information about corruption within the police service and said his life was in danger. His allegations attracted widespread attention, but Shimoli appeared determined to leave his old life behind. He later converted to Islam and adopted the name Muhammad Shaban Maina and settled in Jericho. Here, he operated a taxi business and devoted himself to religion. For a man who had spent years running from the police, it appeared that he was finally trying to build a normal life. But that new beginning would last only a few months, because on August 26, 2007, Edward Maina Shimoli disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was discovered days later along Kangunda Road. His hands were tied, his body showed signs of torture, and he had been shot 10 times. The man who had survived police gunfights, prison escapes, and some of Kenya's most intense manhunts was now dead. His family identified the body at City Mortuary before burying him at Kariokor Cemetery. His burial was only attended by 12 people who hurriedly buried him to prevent any form of altercation with the cops. However, his death immediately raised questions about who had killed Shimoli and why. Some believed he had been executed by police officers who suspected he still knew where millions of shillings from his criminal activities had been hidden. Others pointed to his recent claims about exposing corruption within the police service, suggesting that his allegations may have made him a target. Shimoli had every reason to fear for his life, since he had killed police officers, civilians, and even fellow criminals. And soon, 3 of his brothers would be gunned down in separate police encounters and were eventually buried beside one another. This illustrated the remarkable end for a family whose name had become so closely associated with crime and violence. Shimoli's life in crime ended at the age of 38, and whether he had genuinely reformed or not may never be known. What is certain is that the man who repeatedly outwitted Kenya's security agencies, escaped from prison 3 times, and became one of Kenya's most feared criminals, ultimately met a violent end himself. This has been Dark Hour Docs. Thank you for watching.